You're sitting in the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt, somewhere high above occupied France, with your altimeter steady at 18,000 feet, standard fighter sweep altitude. From up here you can see for miles the patchwork fields, the shining thread of the Seine, and the dark, uneven smudges of Luftwaffe airfields far below. At this height, you feel untouchable, but you're not. Because in the summer of 1943, American fighter pilots were dying up here faster than the Army Air Forces could train and replace them. The statistics told a merciless story. Between June and September 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 214 fighters over Europe, not to engine failure or empty fuel tanks, but to German aircraft that climbed quicker, turned tighter, and had ruled these skies since 1940. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and Fw-190s controlled the airspace between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. They had mastered the bounce, diving out of the sun to rip a P-47 apart with 20mm cannon fire before climbing back to safety, all before the American pilot even realized what hit him. Every mission briefing felt less like a plan and more like a prediction of who wouldn't return. Major Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group at Halesworth, had watched far too many seats go empty in the mess hall by that August. The existing tactical doctrine simply wasn't working. The Army Air Forces taught every pilot to keep altitude advantage, to fight vertically, to never surrender height under any circumstances. It was gospel, but it was getting people killed. Zemke began to question the unthinkable. What if altitude wasn't the answer, but the problem? What if survival lay not above, but below? The thought sounded insane. Flying low meant blindness to incoming threats and no margin for error. One mistake and you'd be a crater in a French field. Low flight also made you slow enough for German flak crews to track you. Every tactical manual declared that single-engine fighters attempting low-level penetration were committing suicide. But Zemke looked at those 214 losses and asked himself a simple question. Compared to what? Compared to the odds they had now? Because those odds were already terrible. So in September 1943, Zemke quietly gathered 3 of his best, Captain Walker Mahurin, Lieutenant Bob Johnson, and Captain Jerry Johnson, and told them to ignore everything they'd been taught about altitude discipline. On the next mission, once bomber escort duty was done, he wanted them to drop, not to 10,000 feet, not 5,000, but all the way down. Skim the trees, he said. See what happens. If command came down hard, he'd take the blame himself. The 3 pilots exchanged glances. Each had lost friends and wingmen in the last few weeks. They didn't hesitate. On September 27, 1943, those 3 P-47s plunged from 18,000 feet to barely 200 feet above the French countryside. They flew so low that farmers threw themselves into ditches as the Thunderbolts roared past. Throttles forward, 350 miles per hour, hugging the terrain. And then something remarkable happened. They spotted a German airfield near Beauvais, Fw-190s parked in neat rows like toys on display. The German pilots never even saw them coming. The P-47s tore across the airfield at propeller height, guns blazing. 4 Fw-190s erupted in fireballs before the flak crews could even man their guns. The Americans stayed low, climbed gently out, and made it home untouched. 0 losses, 4 kills, and a revolution had begun. Flying at treetop level wasn't merely low-level flight. It was the deliberate use of physics as a weapon, turning every German advantage upside down. At 50 feet and 350 miles per hour, the normal rules of air combat broke down entirely, except for the pilot crazy enough to play by new ones. Across occupied France, the Luftwaffe's radar network, Freya and Würzburg systems capable of spotting formations 80 miles away at altitude, was suddenly useless. Radar waves travel in straight lines, and the Earth's curvature became the perfect ally. Below 500 feet, aircraft vanished into what operators called ground clutter, a haze of radar echoes from hills, buildings, and trees. At 50 feet, you were invisible, a ghost screaming across France at 6 miles per minute. The advantage in reaction time was catastrophic for the enemy. Picture a German pilot warming up his FW-190 for a routine patrol. At 18,000 feet, radar gave him 3 minutes to take off, climb, and prepare. At 50 feet, his first warning was the roar of Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines over the treetops. From the first sound to destruction, 11 seconds. No time to run for the plane. No time to man the flak. Barely time to understand that death was already inbound. Soon, American pilots were catching German fighters still chalked on the runway, pilots halfway into their cockpits. It was massacre, not dogfighting. Speed itself became a shield. A P-47 thundering at 350 mph near the ground was simply too fast for anti-aircraft gunners trained for high-altitude targets. Flak crews relied on predictive fire, aim where the target will be, not where it is. But those formulas fell apart at hedge level. By the time an 80mm shell reached your supposed position, you were already a quarter-mile past it. Light flak, the 20mm and 37mm pieces, needed the gunner to track visually and sweep smoothly. You denied them both, appearing as a vapor that vanished before his brain could finish registering the sight. Then came the pursuit problem. Suppose a Bf-109 spots you and dives in. He has speed, position, and what looks like a sure kill. Except he doesn't, because at 50 feet there is no margin for error. Every chasing maneuver risks slamming him into a hillside or a tree. You aren't merely dodging his guns. You're forcing him to choose between shooting you down or murdering himself. And most German pilots elected to pull up, schooled as they were for altitude fighting where 10,000 feet of clearance sat beneath them. No one had trained them to dogfight at the level where birds share the air, and the psychology flipped. The hunter grew fearful while the hunted relaxed into control. American pilots learned to use terrain like submarines use depth. Spot a German fighter and drop into a river valley, follow its curves, and either lose the pursuer's sight or lure him into a warren of hills where his speed becomes a handicap. See a village? Fly straight through it, using houses, steeples, water towers, and tree lines as instant cover. Everything turned into tactical concealment. The Luftwaffe had held the sky, but the Americans stole the ground and made it a weapon. Doctrine didn't alter the laws of physics, and at 50 feet physics favored the attacker. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't conceived for this role. Republic built it as a high-altitude escort, a 7-ton behemoth optimized to operate at 25,000 feet where turbochargers mattered most. Its R-2800 churning out roughly 2,000 horsepower for climb and thin air performance. When pilots began bringing these machines down to treetop level in late 1943, they came back with shredded belly panels, busted oil coolers, and stories of strikes that should have ended them. Republic's engineers realized, to their surprise, they'd inadvertently built an ideal low-level fighter. They simply had to finish the conversion. The first changes were survival engineering. Beginning December 1943, Republic started fitting quarter-inch armor plates to the P-47's belly and lower engine cowling, not so much to stop bullets as to stop France itself. At 50 feet, you weren't just dodging enemy fire, you were dodging trees, telegraph wires, and your own mistakes. Pilots clipped branches, ripped through telephone lines, and somehow stayed airborne. The belly armor gave you a chance to survive the inevitable scrape. Reinforced brackets around the oil cooler followed after 3 pilots limped home with punctured coolers from tree strikes. Lieutenant Francis Gabreski once returned to Halesworth with a 6-foot tree limb jammed in his landing gear. The armor had preserved the hydraulic lines. The gun sight changes were quieter but equally vital. The standard N9 reflector sight was tuned for deflection shooting at altitude, leading targets maneuvering in 3-dimensional space thousands of feet away. At ground level, most targets weren't maneuvering at all. They were parked aircraft, locomotives, fuel trucks, and supply columns. You needed a sight that could snap onto a target in the 2 seconds it stayed in view while you screamed past at 350 miles per hour. By February 1944, Republic began installing modified K-14 gyroscopic sights with altered ranging, effectively turning the Thunderbolt into a weapon that aimed itself. Put the pipper on the mark, squeeze, and 850 cal Brownings erased what you'd selected. They changed the wing racks too. The P-47 could carry bombs, but standard shackles were made for high-altitude drops. Release a 500-pounder at 50 feet, and the blast would kill you as surely as it killed the target. Engineers borrowed low-altitude skip bombing techniques from the Pacific. Rush a bridge or bunker at full speed. Release at the last possible instant, and make the bomb skip like a stone across concrete into a fuel dump. The P-47 D-25 that began rolling out in March 1944 had reinforced wing roots to withstand the stresses of pulling out from those insane attack runs. Yet the most crucial change wasn't hardware, it was training. By April 1944, replacement pilots arriving in England underwent a new qualification course at Aviation, flying navigation runs at 50 feet over the countryside to learn to read terrain at speeds where hesitation meant death. They practiced snap firing at ground targets in 1-second windows and formation flying at hedge height until such low flight felt routine rather than suicidal. Their instructors were men who'd survived months of actual combat over France. The lesson was stark and simple. Altitude will get you killed, speed will save you, and the P-47 can absorb damage that would vaporize other fighters. Trust the airplane, master the low level, and you might make it home. April 8, 1944. The day the Luftwaffe discovered that nowhere in occupied Europe was truly safe anymore. Colonel Hubert Zemke had spent 6 months quietly refining his treetop flying tactics, cycling pilots through the hedge-hopping qualification course, studying reconnaissance data on German airfields, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike all at once. That moment came when spring weather cleared over Normandy, and intelligence confirmed that Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26, two of the Luftwaffe's most elite fighter wings, were rotating squadrons through forward bases near Évreux and Bernay. The Germans believed those airfields were secure, located 60 miles inland, shielded by flak batteries and early warning systems. They were mistaken. Zemke launched a coordinated assault with 48 P-47s from the 56th, 78th, and 353rd Fighter Groups. No bombers to escort, no high-altitude sweep, just low-level hunters unleashed. Once across the French coast, the formations broke apart, dropping from 100 feet to 50, roaring through the countryside in tight 4-ship elements. French resistance observers later reported that the ground itself seemed to tremble. The first formation hit Évreux at approximately 07:47 hours. 16 Bf-109s sat on the ground in varying states of readiness, some taxiing, some refueling, others with pilots still climbing into cockpits. The P-47s appeared out of the morning haze at 360 mph. German gunners never fired a shot. In barely 90 seconds, 11 Bf-109s were blazing wrecks, and the Americans were gone, already racing toward new targets. The genius of Zemke's plan was its timing. The Luftwaffe's command network relied on radio coordination and centralized control. When Évreux was struck, they tried to warn nearby fields, but by then the Thunderbolts were already overhead. Bernay was hit 8 minutes after Évreux. Beaumont-le-Roger 4 minutes later. Luftwaffe controllers were desperately trying to vector interceptors toward threats that had already attacked and vanished. It was like trying to swat flies with a hammer while the flies were dismantling your house. By 09:20 hours, P-47s had struck 7 airfields across a 40-mile radius. Those German pilots who did manage to get airborne found themselves chasing ghosts at altitudes where even one mistake meant instant death. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, one of Zemke's original test pilots from the previous September, led a flight that caught a staffel of FW-190s at Conches Airfield during their morning briefing. The German pilots were standing beside their aircraft when Johnson's formation roared over the boundary fence. The footage from Johnson's gun camera still shocks viewers 8 decades later. FW-190s bursting into fireballs, airmen running for cover, fuel trucks exploding and spreading flames down the flight line. Johnson's after-action report was precise and detached. 4 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 2 more probably destroyed. Heavy damage to fuel storage, no enemy fire encountered, time over target, 11 seconds. 11 seconds that wiped out 2 years of Luftwaffe training and maintenance effort. The week-long April offensive soon nicknamed the Chattanooga Choo-Choo, runs after the Thunderbolts began attacking trains, left 47 confirmed aircraft destroyed on the ground, 23 locomotives eliminated, and countless trucks, depots, and ammunition stores turned into smoking craters. The American cost was minimal: 3 P-47s, 1 lost to flak, 1 to an unseen power line, and 1 to engine failure on the return. The kill ratio stood at 15-1 in the Americans' favor. Suddenly, Luftwaffe base commanders all over France were frantically demanding more flak guns, better camouflage, anything that could stop the hedge-hopping Thunderbolts. German radio intercepts crackled with desperation. The hunters had become the hunted, and no one in the Reich seemed to know how to respond. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, commanding Germany's fighter forces, read the April loss reports and instantly recognized the scale of the threat. Losing aircraft in combat was one thing. Replacements could be built, pilots could be trained, but losing them on the ground along with fuel trucks, ammunition, and maintenance crews was catastrophic. It was draining the Luftwaffe faster than Germany's collapsing supply system could recover. On April 19, 1944, Galland issued Directive 487 to all Jagdverbände commanders in France. Disperse aircraft at least 800 meters from runways, strengthen flak defenses along approach paths, and establish visual observer posts in surrounding villages. It was a tactical band-aid over an arterial wound, and Galland knew it. The flak repositioning began first, since it was the simplest measure. Luftwaffe ground units hauled dozens of 20mm automatic cannons away from the airfield perimeters and placed them nearly a kilometer out, hoping to hit the Thunderbolts before they entered firing range. It made no difference at all. The Americans simply dropped lower, using folds in the terrain and lines of trees to conceal their approach until they were already inside the flak's defensive range. By the time the gunners began tracking their targets, the Thunderbolts had fired, hit, and vanished past them at speeds no flak crew could follow. Worse still, moving the guns into open fields made them easy prey. P-47 pilots soon began hunting the flak positions themselves, strafing them with .50 caliber fire that tore through crews and equipment alike. One German battery commander near Dreux reported losing 17 men in 3 weeks without ever landing a single hit on an American aircraft. The observer system proved somewhat more effective, though it brought its own complications. The Luftwaffe enlisted French civilians, some volunteering, others under threat, to watch the roads and farmland around airfields and call in warnings when they heard engines overhead. It bought them perhaps 30 seconds of reaction time, barely enough for pilots to run from their planes, saving themselves but not their aircraft. The French resistance quickly uncovered the system and began feeding false reports, sending German personnel rushing to their dispersal points for phantom raids, while real Thunderbolts attacked elsewhere. By mid-May, the network was so corrupted with misinformation that German commanders stopped relying on it altogether. The dispersal strategy that followed was even more desperate. Instead of parking aircraft neatly beside the runways for quick launches and easy servicing, ground crews hid them individually in woods, barns, or camouflaged revetments scattered across the countryside. It spared planes from strafing but destroyed efficiency. A Bf-109 hidden in a farmer's barn 2 kilometers from the airstrip needed 20 minutes to reach the runway, refuel, arm, and take off, defeating the very idea of a rapid response fighter base. The Americans had forced the Luftwaffe into an impossible choice: protect their aircraft or actually use them. They chose protection, which meant that even the fighters that survived couldn't get airborne in time to matter. Galland tried one final counter in late May, Operation Werger, a plan to use FW-190s fitted with extra armor and heavy cannons to hunt the low-flying Thunderbolts. The idea was that these reinforced fighters could patrol at low altitude and catch the P-47s during attack runs while they were focused on ground targets. It failed almost immediately. The armored 190s were slower, less agile, and at 50 feet, those disadvantages were fatal. In the first week of Werger missions, the Luftwaffe lost 6 modified fighters without scoring a single victory. The project was abandoned quietly. There was simply no defense against hedge hopping. The tactic refused to fight by the old rules. It exploited every weakness in the Luftwaffe's defensive system at once. The Germans might adapt to one or two elements, but never all simultaneously. By June 1944, Luftwaffe commanders in France had accepted a grim fact. Their planes weren't safe on the ground, weren't safe taking off, and the Americans could appear anywhere, anytime. Air superiority had evolved into something darker: air terror. Flying at 50 feet demanded an entirely new kind of survival instinct that had nothing to do with Luftwaffe doctrine. You could execute every tactic perfectly, hit every target, and still die because a flock of starlings burst through your canopy at 350 miles per hour. Lieutenant James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group learned this on May 3, 1944, when a bird strike shattered his windscreen over the Loire Valley. Blood, feathers, and splintered plexiglass filled his cockpit. Half blind, wind tearing at his face at 300 miles/hour, he somehow held the stick steady and climbed away from death. He landed on an emergency strip with glass shards embedded in his cheeks. The bird had been a crow. After that, pilots started calling them flying flak and learned to read bird movements like omens. If you saw birds scatter, something was there: wires, trees, or another plane. The birds knew the land better than you did. Power lines were even worse because you couldn't see them until the impact. France's rural power grid was a web of death strung between wooden poles at exactly the height where American pilots flew. The wires were thin, nearly invisible, and strong enough to slice through aluminum like a razor. During April and May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 9 P-47s to power line strikes. Not combat kills, not even enemy action. Just recorded as struck obstacle during low-level flight. Lieutenant William O'Brien hit a line near Chartres that wrapped around his propeller, snapping 3 telephone poles before breaking loose. The shock nearly tore his engine from its mounts. He managed to fly another 10 miles before violent vibrations forced him to bail out. When rescuers reached the wreck, they found 40 feet of copper wire still wound around the Thunderbolt's propeller blades. The psychological strain of hedge-hopping wasn't rooted in the fear of dying. Every combat pilot accepted that possibility, but in the fear of dying stupidly. At high altitude, if you were killed, it was combat, honorable, expected. Someone would write your mother a letter about your courage and sacrifice. At 50 feet, if you died, it was because you misjudged a hill, missed a chimney, or let your attention slip for half a second. Your wingman would simply report, flew into the ground, and everyone would know it was your own mistake. That quiet shame created a mental weight that some pilots couldn't bear. In May 1944, 3 men from the 56th Fighter Group requested transfers back to high-altitude escort missions because they couldn't handle the constant tension of low-level flight anymore. One of them, a captain with 14 confirmed kills, told the flight surgeon he'd rather face the entire Luftwaffe at 20,000 feet than fly another mission skimming treetops. The surgeon approved the request without judgment. Everyone understood. The physical toll was just as punishing. Flying at top speed for long stretches while endlessly scanning terrain and threats pushed human endurance far beyond normal combat stress. Your body pumped adrenaline for hours. Your eyes strained to read the rushing ground. Your hands and arms made hundreds of minute corrections to stay stable in airspace where a 2-degree error meant instant death. After each mission, pilots would climb out of their Thunderbolts drenched in sweat despite the cold. Some couldn't hold a coffee cup steady for an hour. Flight surgeons recorded cases of tremors so bad that men couldn't write their reports and had to dictate them instead. And then there were those who adapted too well, the ones who stopped fearing it. They began taking reckless risks, flying at 30 feet instead of 50, attacking targets they should have ignored. Squadron commanders watched for that change because overconfidence at that altitude was fatal every single time. Major Gerald Johnson grounded one of his best pilots in May after the man flew under a railway bridge just because he could. Not because it broke regulations, but because he'd lost his fear, and that was a death sentence. At 50 feet, a healthy fear was your only safeguard. Lose it, and you wouldn't last. June 6, 1944, 0530 hours. Dawn over Normandy. 156,000 Allied soldiers were storming 5 invasion beaches in the largest amphibious assault ever attempted. The entire plan rested on a single crucial expectation: that the Luftwaffe wouldn't appear. Not that it couldn't, but that it wouldn't, because the Americans had made any attempt suicidal. General Eisenhower had staked the invasion on air supremacy, and the hedge-hopping P-47s were about to prove him right. Before the first landing craft reached the sand, 289 Thunderbolts were tearing across northern France at treetop level, targeting every Luftwaffe base within 150 miles of the beaches. The assault began at 0445, 90 minutes before H-hour. The timing was exact. Strike at dawn, when German pilots were prepping patrols to investigate the invasion fleet radar had tracked through the night. At Crippled Airfield, 35 miles north of Paris, a formation of Bf-109s was taxiing for takeoff when 8 P-47s from the 78th Fighter Group emerged from the morning haze. The German pilots had their canopies open, focused on checklists and instruments. They died without ever realizing what hit them. 18 Bf-109s destroyed in the time it takes to read this paragraph. At Beauvais, Abbeville, Amiens, the same story unfolded. Fighters burned on the ground before they could defend the beaches that were slipping away. The hedge-hopping tactics evolved in real time that morning, becoming more precise and coordinated than ever before. Fighter groups maintained a constant rhythm of attacks. As one flight pulled off target, another swept in from a different direction. The Germans never had a moment to recover. Radio intercepts captured Luftwaffe controllers shouting over each other, issuing contradictory orders, trying to direct interceptors against attackers coming from every compass point. At 0620 hours, Jagdgeschwader 26 tried to launch a Staffel from Lille-Vendeville to strike the beaches. They managed to get 4 planes airborne before Thunderbolts hit the field. Those 4 aircraft were immediately intercepted by high-flying P-51s waiting above the clouds. None reached Normandy. The destruction that morning went beyond aircraft and fuel. It was psychological, an assault on the Luftwaffe's confidence itself. By 0800, while American troops were clawing their way through the surf at Omaha Beach, the Luftwaffe had managed to get exactly 2 aircraft over the invasion zone. Both reconnaissance planes, both shot down within minutes. Hitler reportedly spent the morning in a rage, demanding to know where his air force was. The answer was obvious. It was burning on airfields all across France. The hedgehoppers had flown 847 individual sorties that day, an operational pace that should have been beyond human limits. They didn't fly neat, planned 8-hour missions with rest breaks in between. They flew, landed, rearmed, refueled in 20 minutes, and took off again. Some pilots managed 4 sorties before the sun went down. Ground crews worked at such a frenzied pace that several literally collapsed from exhaustion by nightfall. As daylight stretched on, the P-47s expanded their hunt beyond airfields, methodically destroying anything that moved toward Normandy: trains, convoys, bridges, and fuel depots. If it could help the Germans counterattack, it became a target. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski led one flight that caught a German panzer column on the road toward Caen. The tanks were sealed up tight, crews inside, moving at speed without any air cover. Gabreski's group had no bombs, only 50 caliber API rounds, armor-piercing incendiaries. They came in low, strafing from rear angles where the armor was weakest. 3 Panzerfraus went up in flames, their ammunition detonating in violent secondary explosions. The column broke apart, vehicles scattering into the tree line and staying hidden until nightfall. Multiply that by 50 roads, and you understand why German reinforcements that should have reached Normandy in 6 hours took nearly 3 days. By sunset on June 6th, the Luftwaffe had flown 319 sorties over the invasion area. The Allies had flown 14,074. The difference was hedge-hopping. Every German aircraft that managed to survive the morning's ground attacks still had to run a deadly gauntlet of low-flying American fighters between base and battlefield. Those few that did make it through achieved almost nothing. The invasion succeeded because the air over those beaches belonged entirely to the Allies. And it belonged to them because P-47 pilots had spent 7 relentless months learning how to destroy an air force before it could even get off the ground. D-Day wasn't only won on the beaches. It was won at 50 feet over France, one burning Messerschmitt at a time. The hedge-hopping revolution didn't end with the war's conclusion. It rewrote how every air force thought about close air support and battlefield interdiction. By August 1944, every Allied air force in Europe had incorporated some form of treetop-level tactics. British Typhoons and Tempests began flying similar low-altitude strikes. Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix, already masters of ground attack, refined their attack runs using lessons drawn from American reports. Even the Luftwaffe tried to imitate the technique in its remaining operational zones, but by then they lacked the fuel, the training, and the aircraft to make it effective. The P-47 hedgehoppers had proven something fundamental, that air superiority wasn't just about owning the skies above the front. It was about commanding every layer of airspace, right down to the ground itself. Altitude alone no longer guaranteed victory. To win, you had to dominate from treetop to stratosphere. The casualty statistics made the brutal truth clear, yet they also justified the method. Between April and August 1944, P-47 groups flying low-level missions destroyed 1,823 German aircraft on the ground, 2,015 locomotives, more than 9,000 trucks and armored vehicles, plus hundreds of bridges and fuel depots. They lost 289 Thunderbolts during the same period, 114 to flak, 87 to terrain or mechanical failures, 67 to enemy fighters, and 21 to unknown causes. A loss rate of about 15% through 5 months of the fiercest aerial combat in history. Harsh numbers, but sustainable ones. And more importantly, the aircraft they obliterated on the ground never got the chance to shoot down Allied bombers, strafe Allied soldiers, or challenge the skies above France. In the math of attrition, victory went to the side that could replace what it lost. And by mid-1944, that side was no longer Germany. The Korean War saw American pilots applying the same hedge-hopping principles against North Korean and Chinese forces, with devastating results. F-80s and F-84s streaked across the Korean landscape at treetop height, striking supply convoys and airfields using tactics perfected over France nearly 10 years earlier. The speeds were higher now, jets instead of propeller-driven fighters, but the fundamental method stayed exactly the same. Fly low, fly fast, use the terrain, and hit the target before the enemy realizes you're there. The Vietnamese would later learn those lessons in the hardest way possible, as American F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs flew low-level interdiction runs along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The term changed. Nap of the Earth, flying replaced hedge-hopping. But the DNA remained pure, 1944 Thunderbolt. Modern close air support doctrine still bears the unmistakable fingerprints of those P-47 pilots. The A-10 Warthog, designed in the 1970s specifically for low-altitude ground attack, embodied every principle learned over France. Heavy armor on the belly, redundant control systems, weapons tailored for striking ground targets, and training focused on terrain masking and high-speed attack runs. Air Force survival courses still teach the same rules that Hubert Zemke's pilots discovered through trial and error. Altitude offers visibility, but the ground gives you surprise. That at low altitude, speed provides better protection than agility at high altitude, and that the terrain itself can be your greatest weapon if you know how to use it. The planes evolved, the technology advanced, but the core philosophy, using terrain and velocity to achieve surprise, remained doctrine. The psychological lesson may be even more profound than the tactical one. The hedge-hopping campaign proved that accepted wisdom could be dead wrong, that peacetime doctrine often collapses under real combat pressure, and that sometimes the best idea is the one that sounds insane at first. Hubert Zemke was never court-martialed for his unauthorized experiments. Instead, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. The Army Air Forces, and later the independent U.S. Air Force, absorbed a lasting lesson about innovation under fire. When the losses become intolerable, you don't repeat the same tactics harder. You question everything, test new ideas, and let your junior officers innovate. That mindset became a permanent part of American air power doctrine. Walk through the Air Force Museum in Dayton today, and you'll see a P-47 Thunderbolt hanging from the ceiling. The placard describes it as a high-altitude bomber escort with a massive radial engine. That's true, but it's not the full story. The Thunderbolt was deadliest when it flew lowest, when its pilots pointed that powerful nose toward the earth instead of the sky, turning it into a hedge-hopping predator that taught an entire generation how to fight where surprise and physics mattered more than altitude or elegance. 7 months, 50 feet, and the courage to defy every established rule. That's how American pilots caught the Luftwaffe completely off guard, and in doing so, helped to win the war.